The morning Alina Hart buried the man who taught her not to flinch when called a name, she found the funeral home bleeding. Black paint dripped from the front door of Hart and Sons like open wounds. The word "traitor" slashed across the wood in angry, uneven letters. The sour smell of it, still fresh under the rising Georgia heat, filled her nose as she stood frozen on the cracked stone steps, her grandfather's funeral program slipping from her hands. She bent slowly, picking up the paper with shaking fingers. His face stared up at her from the glossy print, the stern, proud lines of Reverend Charles Hart, the man who had spent a lifetime burying the forgotten and the scorned, giving dignity to those the town would rather erase. A man who had survived Jim Crow, cross burnings, whispered threats, and yet somehow, through sheer force of will, kept his head high until the very end. Now he was gone, and the message sprayed across the funeral home told her exactly what kind of welcome she would inherit. For a long moment, Alina just stood there, feeling the eyes on her. Behind curtains, behind cracked windows, pretending not to look. Ashborough always pretended. Pretended its history was history. Pretended the scars had healed. Pretended she, standing there in her good dress, stained with funeral dirt, was the problem for daring to hope. The sky pressed low and heavy. Cicadas buzzed in the humidity. Across the street, an old man leaned against his truck, arms crossed, gaze hidden beneath the brim of his cap. He didn't move. No one did. Alina wiped her hand across her skirt, leaving a smear of black paint on the pale fabric. She took a deep breath, the way her grandfather had taught her, filling her lungs even when it burned. "You are a Hart," he would say, thumb tilting her chin up. "And hearts do not bend." She stepped forward and pushed open the door. It creaked in protest. Inside, the funeral home was cool, dim, and solemn, smelling faintly of lemon oil and old lilies. Dust floated through the air in lazy spirals, catching the thin beams of sunlight that forced their way through narrow windows. Everything was exactly as it had been left yesterday. The neat rows of chairs, the flower arrangements now beginning to wilt, the polished caskets lined like silent sentinels. The place felt abandoned already. She crossed the threshold, her heels clicking against the worn wood floor. The silence swallowed the sound almost immediately, the building itself seeming to hold its breath. She could feel its history wrapping around her, the years of whispered grief, of quiet resilience, of families who had no other place to turn. Hart and Sons had been more than a business. It had been a sanctuary, and now it was a battlefield. Alina dropped the funeral program onto the front desk and pressed her palms flat against the wood, grounding herself. Her phone buzzed in her purse, a sharp, impatient sound against the hush. She didn't reach for it. She didn't have to. She already knew it would be messages she didn't want to read, polite condolences layered over cowardice, apologies hiding behind obligations. Outside, a truck engine revved, tires spitting gravel as it pulled away. She stared at the closed door, at the flicker of movement through the frosted glass, feeling something deep and sour knot itself in her chest. For the first time since coming home, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Her gaze drifted to the corner, where a dusty urn caught the light. Her grandfather's first service, a nameless man buried with dignity no one else had offered. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice, low and steady. "You give them dignity, even when no one else will." Alina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the funeral home settle onto her bones. When she opened them again, her hands were steady. She grabbed a rag from the supply closet, wet it at the utility sink, and walked back out into the choking heat. One stroke at a time, she began to scrub the word from the door, the paint smearing and staining her hands, her arms, her dress, until it looked as if she were bleeding too. The sun climbed higher, thickening the air until it clung to Alina's skin like wet cotton. By noon, she had scrubbed most of the paint away, but faint ghosts of the letters still haunted the wood. No matter how hard she wiped, the stains remained, like bruises the building refused to forget. Inside, the funeral home felt heavier than before. She moved through it slowly, checking supply closets, tidying small things, anything to fill the silence. The smell of lemon oil and lilies had turned sour. Every corner seemed to hum with questions she didn't want to answer. The old office at the back of the building still held her grandfather's presence, the battered oak desk, the creaky chair, the faded photo of Martin Luther King Jr. pinned above the filing cabinet. She sat in the chair, feeling it groan under her weight, and pulled out the list she had written 2 months ago. Plans. Dreams. A better future. The words blurred together now. New website. Community seminars. Expanded services for all families, black, white, immigrant. Make Hart and Sons a place where grief didn't wear a color. She had believed in it with her whole heart. She still wanted to. She just hadn't expected the cost to come so soon, so sharp. The front bell chimed, a high, brittle sound that startled her from her thoughts. She straightened, smoothing her dress, heart hammering in her chest. The first visitor since the funeral. For a moment, she imagined it would be one of the old families, the Crawfords, maybe, or the Jeffersons, coming to reassure her that they stood by her. That this place still mattered. That she still mattered. Instead, it was Matthew Price. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, tall and thin with messy blonde hair and a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His work boots tracked a thin line of dust across the polished floor. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over nervously. "Miss Hart," he said, voice low and careful, as if trying not to break something fragile. Alina rose slowly. The town already buzzed with stories about Matthew, about the Price family legacy, about the skeletons in their closets. His father's name was still spoken in hard tones at church picnics, muttered in barber shops. Alan Price, the man who had once stood at the courthouse steps protesting integration, shouting until his face turned red. And yet here stood his son, in worn boots and a second-hand jacket, asking for a chance. Alina crossed her arms. "You're early." He nodded, shifting on his feet. "Figured. You might need help. After yesterday." The weight of those words pressed against her ribs. He must have heard about the vandalism. Of course he had. In Ashborough, bad news traveled faster than the river in flood season. She studied him for a long moment. The safe choice would be to send him away. To thank him politely and say no thank you and lock the door behind him. That's what everyone expected. But her grandfather's voice stirred in her memory again, stubborn and tired. You don't fix rot by pretending it's not there. You dig it out. You let fresh air in. "Come in," Alina said at last. Matthew hesitated, almost like he didn't believe her. Then he stepped inside, letting the door fall closed behind him. The two of them stood in the empty space of the foyer, two threads of history knotted together in an uneasy truce. Neither of them spoke. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, sharp and lonely. Inside, Alina felt the ground shift under her feet, a small, dangerous beginning. The rumors started before the sun even set. At the diner, 2 tables over a chipped Formica counter, Mrs. Elsie Boone stirred her coffee and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "A Hart girl letting a Price boy handle the dead. Lord have mercy." At the gas station, a boy with a snapback turned to his friend and snickered. "Next thing you know, she'll be asking Alan Price himself to say a prayer over the caskets." And in the church parking lot, after evening service, Deacon Harris shook his head so hard his reading glasses slipped down his nose. Her granddaddy would roll over in his grave if he could see what's going on. Alina heard it all, even when no one spoke to her directly. The town spoke in glances, in silences heavier than words. Women who once hugged her after service now walked past without so much as a nod. Men she had known since childhood offered tight, obligatory greetings, their eyes sliding away the moment she met them. She worked through it. She stayed late, polishing caskets until her hands ached, reviewing price lists and service contracts, pretending not to notice when the appointment calendar stayed empty. Matthew showed up every morning exactly at 8, quiet, steady, respectful. He never spoke unless spoken to, never lingered longer than necessary. He handled the embalming room with a skill she couldn't deny. Still, the phone rang less. The chairs stayed empty longer. And slowly, quietly, the walls began to close in. The final confirmation came 3 weeks after her grandfather's funeral. Alina stood in the front office, flipping through invoices, when the door opened and Clara Whitmore walked in, one of the town's matriarchs, a woman who had once sewn quilts for Alina's mother, who had wept in the front row at Reverend Hart's sermons. Clara didn't sit. She didn't even greet her. "We'll be moving my husband's arrangements to Holloway's funeral parlor," she said stiffly, as if each word had been chiseled out of stone. "Nothing personal, child." Alina met her gaze, steady as she could, though her throat burned. "Nothing personal," she echoed. Clara hesitated, just long enough to almost look ashamed. Then she turned, walking out as fast as her stiff knees would carry her. The door swung shut with a dull thud. Alina stood still, the invoice paper crumpling slightly in her hand. Outside, the streets of Ashborough stretched silent and hot under the weight of their own history. Inside, the funeral home seemed to exhale, a soft, tired sigh, as another piece of it was chipped away. Later that night, when she locked up, she found something else waiting for her. A dead crow nailed to the back door, its feathers ragged, wings spread wide as if frozen mid-flight. No note this time. None needed. The message was clear. The dead crow haunted her dreams that night. She woke before dawn, tangled in sweat-damp sheets, the ghost of black feathers still clinging to her mind. For a long time, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the brittle silence of the house. The kind of silence that only grew heavier the longer you listened. When the sun finally pried open the sky, Alina rose, dressed, and walked to the funeral home without touching her coffee, without checking her phone. Her hands moved through the morning routines by muscle memory, unlocking doors, flicking on lights, straightening the guest chairs. But nothing could scrub the image from the back of her mind. She needed to talk to someone. Someone who would tell her she wasn't crazy, that she wasn't betraying anything by trying to move forward. Someone who would remind her why she had come back in the first place. She found her mother on the back porch of their small house, sipping tea and shelling peas into a wide blue bowl. Lorraine Hart had never been a loud woman, but her silences spoke volumes. She didn't look up when Alina stepped onto the porch, just patted the seat beside her. Alina sat, though it warm under her hands. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sound of pea shells snapping open was steady, almost soothing. "They left a crow on my door," Alina said at last, voice flat. Lorraine didn't flinch. She kept shelling, methodical. "I heard." Alina waited for more. An apology. A word of comfort. Something. But the morning air stayed still between them. Finally, Lorraine sighed, deep and tired. "You're stirring things that don't want to be stirred, baby. Folks around here, they like their ghosts right where they buried them." Alina clenched her jaw. "I'm not trying to erase anything. I'm trying to build something better." Lorraine nodded, as if she understood. And maybe she did. But understanding didn't always mean agreement. "They'll call you worse than traitor before they're through," she said softly. "You ready for that?" Alina swallowed hard. "I thought I was." Lorraine placed a handful of shelled peas into the bowl, wiped her hands on her apron, and finally looked at her daughter, really looked. "Your granddaddy fought to carve out a place for us in a world that didn't want to make room. You're trying to open the doors even wider." She paused, the lines around her mouth deepening. "Just make sure you're not opening them so wide that you forget who kept you standing all these years." The words stung more than they should have. Alina turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sun burned low over the fields, making the earth look like it was smoldering. She thought of Matthew, of the careful way he moved through the funeral home, of the way he avoided meeting her eyes some days, as if ashamed of ghosts he hadn't created. She thought of the families pulling away, the whispered accusations trailing behind her like smoke. Alina had come home to heal, to stitch something new over the old wounds. Instead, she felt like she was ripping fresh ones open. And for the first time, doubt slid cold and sharp into her chest. Maybe they were right. Maybe hope was just another kind of betrayal. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon, brittle and raw. The funeral home was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak of the old floorboards sound like a warning. Alina sat at the front desk, staring at the dusty appointment book, flipping pages that remained stubbornly blank. The doors swung open without the jingle of the bell. She looked up, expecting a family, maybe a delivery. Instead, she found Jameson Brooks, one of the deacons from New Morning Baptist Church, a man who had called her child so warmly at her grandfather's services that it almost sounded like love. But not today. Jameson walked in with a slow, heavy tread, his Sunday hat clutched in both hands like a shield. Behind him stood two others, Mrs. Lila Rollins, matron of every prayer circle in town, and Marcellus Green, owner of the largest black-owned hardware store for 3 counties. No one smiled. No one sat. Alina rose instinctively, smoothing the front of her blouse. "Afternoon," she said, voice steady. Jameson nodded, almost painfully. "We came to talk, Alina." The formality of her first name hit harder than she expected. Mrs. Rollins' hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse tighter against her side. Marcellus Green looked down at the scuffed toes of his boots, as if he wanted to be anywhere else. Jameson cleared his throat. "It's about changes. Folks are concerned." Alina folded her arms. "Concerned about what?" He shifted, voice lowering. "You know what about. About the choices you're making. About who you're bringing into this place." A long, aching pause. Mrs. Rollins finally broke the silence, her voice a strained whisper. "Some wounds don't heal just because we want them to." Alina felt her chest tighten, the air around her growing thinner. Marcellus Green raised his eyes, sadness weighing them down. "Your granddaddy bled for this place, Alina. We all did, in our way. This funeral home, it ain't just a business. It's a shelter. It's memory. It's survival." And now, Jameson added, softer but sharper, "Some are saying you've forgotten that." The words settled between them, heavy as gravestones. Alina straightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "I haven't forgotten," she said, voice raw. "I just believe it can be more. For everyone." Jameson gave a long, weary sigh. "Not everyone deserves it, child. Some things can't be washed clean." For a moment, Alina saw it all too clearly, the years layered like sediment, the hate, the hurt, the survival that had cost so much it calcified into a wall no one dared tear down. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. The 3 of them stood for a moment longer, waiting, as if hoping she would apologize, recant, close the door she had dared to open. But Alina said nothing. Finally, they turned and left, the door closing behind them with a soft, defeated click. Alina remained standing in the center of the room, her breath shuddering out of her. She was alone, truly alone now, abandoned not by enemies, but by those she had loved. That night, when she went to lock up, she found another note slipped under the door. Not paint, not nails, just a folded piece of paper, scrawled in hard, ugly handwriting. "You can bury the dead, but you can't bury who you are." Alina held it for a long time, her fingers trembling. And for the first time since coming home, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Days passed, thick and dragging. The funeral home echoed with absence, no mourners, no calls, just the hollow sound of her own footsteps crossing the worn floorboards. Alina drifted from room to room like a ghost, checking the inventory, dusting the picture frames, straightening chairs that didn't need straightening. The business was crumbling quietly, the way a levee gives way to rising water, slowly, relentlessly, until suddenly there's nothing left. Matthew stayed. Every morning at 8 sharp, he arrived with his coffee in a paper cup, his jacket slung over one shoulder. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pry. He simply worked, polishing wood, restocking supplies, maintaining the embalming room with the careful reverence of someone who knew what it meant to handle the last remnants of a life. One evening, as Alina was closing out the till, a till that barely rattled now, Matthew lingered by the door, cap in hand. "Miss Hart," he said quietly, "I can go." Alina looked up sharply. "What?" He shifted awkwardly, the brim of his cap twisting in his fingers. It ain't hard to see what's happening. Folks pulling their business. Folks turning their backs. I don't want to be the reason you lose what your family built. The words hung there, honest and brutal. Alina stared at him. His face was open, sincere. Not defensive, not proud. Just a man offering her a way out. And for a terrible moment, a whisper inside her begged her to take it. Thank him. Let him leave. Pretend it had never happened. Patch the cracks before the whole damn thing collapsed. But then another voice stirred, her grandfather's, deep and steady in her memory. You don't fix rot by cutting down the tree. You heal it by tending the roots. Alina exhaled slowly. It's not you, Matthew, she said. It's what people think you represent. He looked down at his boots, shame rising unspoken between them. I can't change what my father did, he said quietly. I wish to God I could. Alina watched him. Watched the way the late light from the window caught the dust in the air, the way it painted him in a haze of gold and sorrow. You can't change it, she said, her voice rough. But you can be different. He lifted his gaze, something raw and hopeful flickering there. So can we, Alina whispered. For a moment, neither of them moved. The buildings seemed to lean closer, listening. Then Matthew nodded, once, slow and sure, and stayed. Later that night, sitting alone in the office, Alina opened the appointment book again. The pages were still mostly empty, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel empty with them. Somewhere deep in her chest, something small but stubborn flared back to life. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The idea came to her in the quiet hours just before dawn, when the air was still cool and the sky hadn't yet decided whether to be blue or gray. Alina sat on the back steps of the funeral home, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the streetlights buzz and flicker. The night smelled of damp earth and honeysuckle, a scent so heavy with memory it almost hurt. She thought of the names on the gravestones, of the funerals her grandfather had given to men and women who had died without family, without recognition, without anyone to mourn them, of how he had never asked where someone came from, only who needed them to be honored. The funeral home had always been a place for the forgotten. Maybe it still could be. By midday, she had made the calls. She started with the nursing homes, the shelters, the county hospital morgue, places where the dead waited without ceremony, without family, without hope of a proper farewell. No one expected much. No one ever did. By the end of the week, the flyer was printed, simple black ink on white paper, posted to church bulletin boards, taped to grocery store doors, slipped under windshield wipers at gas stations. Memorial service for the forgotten. Saturday, 4 p.m. at Hart Sons Funeral Home. All are welcome. No one will be turned away. Matthew helped her set up the folding chairs. He didn't ask questions, just worked beside her, moving silently, steady as stone. When Saturday came, Alina stood alone at the front of the funeral home, smoothing down the front of her simple black dress, trying not to count the empty chairs. At first, no one came. Minutes ticked by, slow and cruel. The clock on the wall coughed its hollow ticks into the air. She felt the shame rise hot under her skin, the fear that maybe she had been wrong again, maybe the town didn't want healing, didn't want memory, didn't want her. Then, just as she was about to turn away, the door creaked open. A woman in a faded floral dress stepped inside, carrying a small framed photograph against her chest like a shield. Her hands shook. She said nothing, just took a seat in the second row, head bowed. Then another. An older man in a worn veteran's cap, walking slowly with a cane, his eyes damp and fierce. Then two teenagers, a little boy clutching a folded paper flag, a nurse still in scrubs with a hospital ID swinging from her belt. They came quietly, tentatively, as if unsure they were allowed. Within an hour, the room was half full. No one spoke much. Grief hung in the air, heavy but clean, not anger, not accusation. Just remembrance. Just mourning. Alina stepped to the front. Her voice trembled once, but she swallowed it down. No one here today is alone, she said simply. She read the names that had been given to her. Some real, some half-guessed, some known only by hospital numbers or the first names remembered by nurses and shelter workers. She spoke them all. spoke them into the room, into history. And as she did, something shifted. Not a thunderclap, not a miracle, just a slow, steady uncoiling of something tight and bitter that had lived too long in the bones of Ashborough. The town wasn't healed. The funeral home wasn't saved. But something had cracked open. And through that crack, just maybe, something new could grow. The next morning, Alina found a bouquet of wildflowers on the front steps of the funeral home. No card, no signature, just a handful of yellow and white blooms, tied together with twine, left like an offering. The paint stains from weeks ago were still faintly visible on the door if you looked hard enough. She didn't scrub them anymore. She let them stay, scars the building would carry, same as she did. The phone started ringing again. Not constantly, not like before, but it rang. A young mother who had lost her son to illness and didn't want to hear lectures about race or class, just needed someone to help her say goodbye. A retired teacher who remembered Reverend Hart's sermons and said he trusted the blood that built this place more than any glittering new business. A white mechanic whose sister had passed, too ashamed to call the bigger funeral parlors after years of unpaid debts, who came in with his cap in hand and tears on his cheeks. Small steps, quiet ones. Some neighbors still crossed the street when they saw Alina coming. Some still stared through her like glass. Not everyone clapped after the memorial service. Not everyone forgave. Ashborough wasn't ready to change all at once. Maybe it never would. But here and there, in glances, in murmured thank yous, in tiny acts of mercy, cracks in the old walls had started to appear. Matthew stayed on, working harder than ever, speaking little, his presence a steady hum in the background of her days. Sometimes, when they passed each other in the hall, their eyes would meet, two people tied together not by shared history, but by shared choice. One evening, after locking up, Alina sat on the back steps again, arms around her knees. The air smelled of cut grass and rain clouds gathering far away. She closed her eyes and thought of her grandfather, of the weight he had carried, of the battles he had fought, of the dignity he had demanded for his people, even when the world sneered. Alina knew she hadn't betrayed him. She hadn't forgotten. She had simply picked up the burden he had left behind and chosen to carry it a few steps further, into a future he had prayed might one day be possible. The town would still whisper. The past would still bleed. The door would never fully scrub clean. But Hart and Sons Funeral Home would stand. Not because it was perfect, not because it was safe, but because some things are worth carrying, even when they are heavy. Especially when they are heavy. Alina opened her eyes. The sky stretched wide and bruised above her, aching and beautiful. And she sat there, breathing it in, the grief, the hope, the stubborn, aching life of it all, until the stars began to flicker awake.